King's University College into our Religious Life Lecture Series. I see this evening lots of familiar faces, but I also see some new ones. So welcome to all of you. We hope that you'll have an enjoyable evening with us. And
How do you pronounce your last name again?
Chorny.
We are delighted to have with us this evening Hindy Najman, the Director of Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto. Before we move on to a formal introduction of Hindy, I just have a few little housekeeping announcements that I need to share with you. Tonight's lecture is going to be videotaped. And so about a week from tonight or 2 weeks from this evening, if you go to the King's University College website, to Campus Ministry, and then click on Religious Life Lecture Series, and follow the link, you will be able to find this evening's lecture there for your enjoyment. However, I know that some people like to have a copy for themselves. And if you would like to order a DVD, Andrea and I will be at the back of the room and we'll help you place your order. The cost is $25 per copy. We're grateful for your free will donations this evening. And this evening, the free will donation is going to St. Joseph's Hospitality Center, better known to us Londoners as the Soup Kitchen, which, as many of you know, is located in on Dundas Street in East London. The Soup Kitchen is sponsored by the Sisters of St. Joseph and is supported and operated by the generous giving of numerous friends. The center, as I said, is downtown, provides meals and friendship to those in need. The center has grown to be a gathering place of friendship and caring for all who participate. Guests and volunteers all seek to journey together. Our refreshments this evening have been provided through the Department of Alumni Affairs, and I just invite you to partake as you wish. This evening's lecture is being sponsored by the Center for Jewish Catholic Muslim Learning, and we graciously thank this center for their support this evening. And just a little bit of information on the center. The Center for Jewish Catholic Muslim Learning was officially created on May the 1st, 2010, and was a natural expansion of the former Center for Catholic Jewish Learning. The mission of the CJCML is to foster and nurture the relationship between Jews, Catholics, and Muslims through education, scholarship, and community outreach. It is the hope of the center to provide a forum in which academics and other community members can come together to discuss the many intersections that exist between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and can learn more about each other, thereby exploring new ways to cooperate in a fruitful and in a respectful manner. The CJCML remains committed to rooting out all forms of prejudice. And now I would like to invite Andrea Rector, who is our administrative assistant in the Office of Campus Ministry, as well as the administrative assistant for the CJCML, to come forward and formally introduce Hindy to us. Where are you? There she is.
Good evening. It's my honor on behalf of the CJCML to introduce Dr. Hindy Najman this evening. Dr. Najman graduated from Harvard University, where she received both her MA and her PhD. Her dissertation, entitled Authoritative Writing and Interpretation, A Study in the History of Scripture, was awarded the Harry and Cecile Starr Prize for the best doctoral dissertation in a subject touching on Jewish and Hebrew studies. She has been working at U of T since 2004, and since 2008, Dr. Najman has been the Director for Jewish Studies and Associate Professor of Ancient Judaism in the Department and Center for the Study of Religion and Jewish Studies program at the University of Toronto. Her areas of expertise include the Hebrew Bible, with a special interest in prophecy, wisdom, literature, and ritual, biblical interpretation in ancient Judaism, early rabbinic interpretation, the Dead Sea Scrolls, Hellenistic Judaism, early Judaism, and Christianity as interlocking traditions. In 2003, Dr. Najman published Seconding Sinai, the development of Mosaic discourse Discourse in Second Temple Judaism in the Journal for the Study of Judaism Supplement Series. And we are very pleased if you would join us in welcoming Dr. Hindy Najman.
Sure, thank you. Can you all hear me? I think I'm mic'd. Yes? We good? Thank you. Oops. I think that was the water. It's okay. It's okay. No, we're good. Okay, it's all right. Thank you. So I want to begin this evening by thanking you all for coming and by offering special thanks to Sister Susan Glaub, who thank you for your gracious invitation and for including me in this extraordinary lecture series. I'm honored to be here. I'm honored to be part of your center, and I'm deeply committed to promoting understanding across religious traditions. I think the time now couldn't be more important for this kind of promotion of understanding. In my own work at the University of Toronto, it's an essential piece of what we do to share what Judaism is, what Islam is, what Christianity is, and to combat prejudice of all forms. So I wanted to thank you. I wanted to thank Andrea. I wanted to thank Rabbi Cherney as well for hosting us this evening. I hope all of you have a handout. If you don't, I think there are extras in the back. Just let me know if you don't have one. I'll be referring to it throughout the evening. Raise your hand if you don't have one. Okay, wonderful. What I'm going to share with you this evening comes out of a book that I'm completing now. In this book, I try to understand the ways in which Judaism continued even in the face of the first and then second destruction of the temple, which was the core, which what held all of the pieces of Judaism together: the priesthood, the kingship, the community, the ritual. Divine encounter was centered around the temple itself. And I want to begin by talking about the destruction of the temple, the first temple, in 586 BCE, a destruction that managed to paralyze both the priesthood, the teachers, the scribal community in ancient Judaism, as well as the lay community, as we might refer to them today, that the community that was participating a few times a year still define themselves in terms of Jerusalem. And we know this is true even of the diaspora communities, for example, in Alexandria. Philo of Alexandria talks about Jerusalem as the core, as the center. And we know from the writings of Josephus that prior to the destruction of the temple, again, he was living in Rome and yet nevertheless understood the center to be Jerusalem itself. So this destruction of the first temple, and then again in 70, the second temple, paralyzed Judaism that identified with a temple center. When the first temple was destroyed and the southern kingdom was exiled in the 6th century, one might have expected that the Judean community would have been utterly finished off. And yet, and this is what's so remarkable, the most productive period in the time of ancient Judaism is this period of the exile. The community survived, produced texts, preserved very complicated priestly genealogies, which are then marked in a series of texts from the Hebrew Bible, from the Tanakh. And at the same time, they reimagined the contours of their new present in exile in light of a hoped-for, promised future, right, that was promised by the prophets, by Isaiah, by Jeremiah. This incredible resilience of a people that one might have expected to be destroyed prompted the Dalai Lama a number of years ago to consult Jewish leaders so that he too could preserve his community and his own tradition in the face of persecution of the Tibetan people and the destruction of their spiritual base. I'm going to come back to another point of comparison, another point of parallel between other religious traditions and the Jewish tradition in a few minutes. But let me just ask, what did the Jewish people do right in antiquity? What happened within the ancient Jewish tradition that allowed for or even generated a transmission and survival despite the destruction of and the profound and cruel exile that we know was documented so well and in such a detailed way by the Babylonian chronicles, by Nebuchadnezzar. By tracing and imagining and reimagining exile, we can come to understand the important ways in which the Jewish people have not only survived exile, but converted the experience of exile into a source of spiritual strengthening and even confirmation of their own existence. So instead of it being a paralyzing moment, the moment of devastation, the moment of destruction itself became part of the fabric of Judaism, became part of the prayers, became part of the experience of exile and diaspora. This narrative, this story of exile and suffering began, one could argue, with the 6th century before the Common Era, or perhaps even before the exile of the northern tribes in the 8th century. The struggle to overcome exile was already part of that story. The fact that the first destruction was never overcome became an integral part of the story. What I want to do now is I want to take a few minutes with you, and I want to look for a moment at the impossibility of overcoming exile, the impossibility of the destruction of Second Temple Judaism. And I want to begin by reading with you a psalm that I'm sure all of you know. If you don't know it from prayers, then you might just know it from Leonard Cohen. It's one of the most recent renditions of By the Waters of Babylon. It's a very, very profound psalm. It's really 3 psalms, and I'm going to embed it in one, and I'm going to focus on the first part of the psalm, what I want to call tonight with you the impossible song. I'm going to read it in Hebrew first, and then we will read it in English. Al naharot Bavel, sham yashavnu gam bachinu bezachrenu at Zion, al aravim betocha talinu kinorotenu, ki sham she'elunu shovenu divrei shir, v'tolalenu simcha, shiru lanu mishir Zion. Sing us one of those songs of Zion. Echna shir et shir Adonai al admat nechar. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept as we thought of Zion. There on the poplars we hung up our lyres, for our captors asked us there for songs, our tormentors for amusement. Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing a song of Zion on alien soil? The refusal to sing is an expression of paralysis. To say that one cannot sing is to say that one cannot pray and cannot encounter the divine. But there was a response that transcended the darkness and paralysis, which itself captured the tragedy and the loss and the torment. And that is lament itself. Psalm 137, this impossible song, created a new space as lament itself generated, created, if you will, the space to find a release from the darkness and destruction of exile. So the empty space, the no place of exile and destruction and isolation, and the impossibility of singing again, impossibility of encountering the divine, the impossibility of singing with angels in the heavens, in an ascent and in a communion with the divine, became a kind of redemptive lament, a kind of healing of the experience itself of the destruction. And then part 2 of the psalm, if I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. And then there are a series of formulations before part 3 of the psalm, which is actually a call for revenge, which must be read in the context of the Babylonian chronicles, but that would be for another lecture. So let's take a look at 2 other texts that refuse comfort, both experiencing the exile as the world, everything around us that we ever could have known or ever understood collapsed. Everything fell apart. And I've chosen 2 texts. I must say there are many, many texts within the biblical text and outside of the biblical text where the communities mourned the loss of the temple and expressed their own sense of paralysis, bewilderment, confusion about how to move on. But before they would imagine a new messianic hope, before they could imagine a kind of chaos that would bring about primordial perfection or an Eden again. This is a moment of impossibility. In Jeremiah 31, I'll read just part of this text. Thus says the Lord, A cry is heard in Ramah, wailing, bitter weeping, Rachel weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children who are gone. Restrain your voice, says the Lord, from weeping, your eyes from shedding tears. Here, she refuses comfort. This is a text we will come back to at the very end of the lecture. It becomes a very important text for another text that's written after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. So this text doesn't only apply to the destruction after the First Temple, but as the Jewish people faced subsequent, later destructions in the history of the Jewish people, these texts would serve to comfort them, but also to capture for them the very experience of destruction. Okay. Let's look now at Lamentations, and I've chosen two texts. Again, I'm not actually going to read them all. I'm just going to read the beginning of each of those small paragraphs on text 3 on your handout. For these things do I weep, my eyes flow with tears. Far away from me is any comforter who might revive my spirit, my nefesh. And then the second paragraph from chapter 2, my eyes are spent with tears, my heart is in tumult. My being melts away over the ruin of my people. And at the very end of that paragraph, for your ruin is vast as the sea. Who can heal you? How is healing ever going to be possible again? Nothing can happen again in the face of this destruction. There's a sense of paralysis, of mourning, and a refusal to receive the comforters. A refusal to receive the comforters. What I want to suggest this evening is through the reinterpretation and transformation of prayer to lament, of rereading earlier texts, reinterpreting them in a new context, reimagining a place of destruction as a place of silence and revelation, the Jewish people were able to reimagine a new place in no place, right, in exile. It was a destruction, however, that was never overcome. So it sounds almost like a contradiction. You know, she just said that it could never be overcome, and yet she talks about the survival and the persistence. And it's that tension, it's that bringing together of redefining your space through the experience of exile and recognizing that there's certain things that can never be captured again. There's certain things that can never be recovered again. Let's take a look now. I'm going to come back to text 4 in a minute. Let's first take a look at text 5 on your handout. This is a remarkable text. The Second Temple was rebuilt after Cyrus, the king of Persia, permitted it. We know about Cyrus's policies in 538, before the Common Era, permitted peoples to return to various lands from which they had been exiled. We know this from a cylinder seal, very famous finding. And here we have the foundations are being laid at the Second Temple. This should be a moment of extraordinary joy and celebration. And this is exactly what I just spoke to. When you look at the foundation stone that was set for the Second Temple, you see exactly what I speak to. There's the combining or a marrying, if you will, of mourning, of loss, of crying, of bechi, and simcha, of celebration. Over dinner this evening with some students and faculty and Sister Susan and Rabbi Cherney, we talked about the intimate connectedness in Jewish tradition between the celebration of marriage and the mourning over loss. I don't have time to go into this in great detail now, but that intimacy comes up again and again, the sense of possibility and renewal against the backdrop of our own mortality, our own humility, and our own limitations, and our own vulnerability. Here in this text, it's a crazy text. Many of the priests and Levites, they're about to lay the foundation for the Second Temple. The old men who had seen the first house wept loudly at the sight of the founding of this house. Many others shouted joyously at the top of their voices. Ve'ein ha'am makhirim kol tru'at ha'am simcha l'kol bechi. The people could not distinguish the shouts of joy from the people's weeping. For the people raised a great shout, the sound of which could be heard from afar. We couldn't tell. I mean, this often reminds me of my little ones. When you hear them playing outside, you're not sure. What kind of cry is that? Is that a cry of joy, or is that a cry of pain? And it's usually the parent that can identify, oh, he's fine. You sure? He's fine. And they know which is the sound of cry. And here there's confusion. I can't tell the difference between the crying and the screaming and the extraordinary exuberance, right? Exhilarated sense of release over a second temple. So even when they returned and they were permitted to rebuild their temple, they could not get over the sense of destruction. The tension between remembering the past. Now, is it a historical memory? Probably not. I mean, in this text, was it actually someone who was there who remembered the loss? Was the period of time possible? The memory, the reality, the experience of establishing the second temple brought upon echoes and burden and memory of loss, of a kingdom that was never overcome, of lives that were never returned, and also just a sense of loss, of innocence, of a past kingdom, and a past loss of faith in the prophetic promise. You know, was this a realization or a fulfillment of the second half of Isaiah, of Jeremiah's promises, and of the covenant at Sinai? There's a determination that I want to consider this evening, a determination to create the right conditions for renewed covenant. And what exactly do I mean by a renewal of covenant? If those of you are familiar with biblical traditions will immediately think of the language of New Covenant or of New Testament. The original text is from Jeremiah 31:31. It's actually not on your handout, but it's a text that's very familiar to all of you. In this book of hope or a book of return, in Jeremiah 30:31, Jeremiah speaks of a time is coming where I will make a new covenant, a brit chadashah, with Israel and with Judah, with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And here, this promise for new or renewal will reverberate in the Second Temple community. It'll be very important. It'll be important in many communities that speak of new covenant. For example, the community that was responsible, or communities that were responsible for the scrolls from Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, they also spoke about a new covenant. The language of renewal or New Testament also becomes very, very important for the early Christian communities as well. The possibility of renewing something that was broken or something that was lost. The possibility of writing again, or teaching again the old texts in a way that are meaningful, or rendering the prophetic promises as fulfilled promises, even in the face of destruction, is what Jeremiah in chapter 31 is speaking to. And many, many texts are struggling with the impossibility of recovery and the reality with which they're faced, the challenge with which they're faced, which is to sustain the tradition itself. I want you to permit me, if you will, to turn for a moment of what I have come to consider an extraordinary parallel or analogy to the kind of destruction that I've described in the Second Temple period. To be sure, the Jewish people are not unique in the experience of terror and of torture and of loss. There's a particular story which I found very, very striking about a community of Crow Indians in the United States. There's a scholar by the name of Jonathan Lear who has written about the Crow Indians, and he describes the leader, Plenty Coups, of the Crow, and he speaks to the way in which this leader refused to speak of his life after the passing of the buffalo, that is, before they were restricted to reservation. His story, the story of Plenty Coups, seems to have broken off as he tells his past, leaving many, many years unaccounted for. And here, of course, what's reverberating in my head is, how can we sing a song of Zion on foreign land? Is it possible to sing again? Is it possible to dream again? Is prophecy possible again? Is divine encounter possible again? This is text 4 that I skipped over and I'm going to go back to now. And this is what Plenty Coups says. I've not told you half of what happened when I was young, he said when urged to go on. I can think back and tell you much more of war and house stealing, but when the buffalo went away, the hearts of many people fell to the ground and they could not lift them up. But by which he means, and this is developed much more, the language of prophecy, the language of dream, the language of song, and the language of tradition. After this, nothing happened. There was little singing anywhere. Besides, he added, you know that part of my life as well as I do. You saw what happened to us when the buffalo went away. After this, he says, nothing happened. What could Plenty Coups' utterance mean? If we take him at his word, he seems to be saying that there was an event or a happening that was going away. Or to get the timing right, Plenty Coups came to see as he looked back that there was a moment after which nothing happened, as if history came to an end. But what would it mean for history to exhaust itself, for history to be over? Our text of Psalm 137 and Plenty Coups' words describe communities that are bereft of ritual and context, bereft of tradition and the possibility of transmission. There are many texts from Judaism which depict that nothing happening after the first destruction, the silence, the paralysis. Our writers write and link the experience of exile ultimately with the sense of loss and abandonment, and with suffering in the wilderness, a kind of end of history, and to quote again Lamentations, no priest, no prophet. This sense of loss. And ultimately, as Ezekiel, the prophet in exile, speaks, that the removal of divine presence, the removal of the Shekhinah, and there are many rabbinic traditions that actually talk about God's hands being bound, symbolically removing God's self from the community. So, what could it mean for history to be over? For the story that I've told with the Crow Indians, Jonathan Lear goes on to chart the way the memory of the Crow are transformed and ultimately were brought back to life. It happened through the recontextualizing of the past and the present, through a new dream, through transforming exile into a new context for revelation, in which ultimately translated suffering into redemption. I'm going to ask you to jump for a moment to page 2 of your handout. And I want you to look with me for a moment at text 9, which we're going to come back to at the very end of the, what am I doing? Is it not working?
It's making a noise, that's why.
Maybe I'm moving around too much. How's that? Is that better?
I think that's
Better? Yeah, raise your hand if you can't hear me. No?
It was making a,
Okay,
like a
sorry.
heartbeat sound.
Yes, maybe it was my heart. Okay. Text 9. For in a time of cultural collapse, living memory of that living way of life will last only a few years. The most important artifact white man could offer the Indian was writing and printing. In the Phaedrus, Socrates argues that writing can function as a form of forgetting rather than remembering, for it can lull one into thinking that remembering when one is only moving the phrases about. Whatever the dangers here, when one's whole way of life is on the verge of collapse, the worry about writing becomes a luxury. The entire culture is in the process of being forgotten. The only hope is to write it down in the hope that future generations may bring it back to life. So too, I want to say, for ancient...
Sorry. I think we're going to
We're going to go back to the mic.
I'm
Sure.
sorry. I'm sorry, everybody.
Sure.
We just wanted to
So let's focus for a moment while we're switching mics on that very last line of text 9. Which mic should I take off?
this one.
Okay.
It's not their fault.
Sure. No, it's okay. Thank you. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to-
Okay, thank you. So let's read that last line again. Oops, let's read that last line again. The entire culture is in the process of being forgotten. The only hope is to write it down in the hope that future generations may bring it back to life. Now, Jonathan Lear, in this study about the crow, has a very interesting footnote here where he refers to Psalm 137 and he offers an analogy to ancient Judaism. Before this book came out, he gave a talk at the University of Toronto as I started working on this project. And I was very inspired by that moment, that convergence of this contemporary example and Jewish antiquity. For ancient Judaism, the only hope is to write it down in the hope that future generations may bring it back to life. The living, giving force of writing became linked with ritual as the future of the tradition. But many people speak about the writing down in ancient Judaism as a kind of end of prophecy. And part of what I want to suggest here today is the writing itself becomes a kind of efficacious prayer. The writing and the reading and the interpretation is already a part of the prophetic tradition. It's not the end of divine encounter. It's one form of divine encounter, which is operative and essential to the history of Judaism in antiquity. When people talk about the textualization of late ancient Judaism, they often talk about the giving up of ritual, of inspired ritual or priestly, efficacious prayer or prophecy. Here I want to say that it's absolutely the case that the Torah and the texts and writing and reading became an essential part of prayer and healing, and the act of study itself became redemptive. But that's not because revelation ended. Quite to the contrary, it became a way of realizing revelation itself. It became a way of realizing divine encounter. We still must acknowledge that the realization is but a refraction through a memory of a lost past. That is, the sense of loss, although I'm celebrating the possibility of divine encounter as ongoing, I also want to remind you of this theme that must run through my presentation this evening of loss and struggle. Now we're going to move to perhaps a more upbeat part of my talk. My daughter said to me, she's 11, she said, "What are you talking about, Mama, tonight?" And I told her, she said, "God, that's depressing." So there is hope. I want to talk about ways in which writing and covenant becomes possible again. And I want to particularly talk about text 6 on your handout. And then we'll also compare it with text 8. So this is on page 2 of your handout, the top text. This is part of the giving of the law again in the Second Temple period. The people are gathered together in the broad open space in front of the water gate. They ask Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the Torah of Moses that the Lord commanded Israel. He brings the Torah before the assembly men and women and all who could hear with understanding on the first day of the 7th month. He reads it aloud from before the broad open space, and you see the men, women, interpreters, they listen to the book, and he's standing, the next line, on a wooden tower which they crafted for this thing. He opens the scroll before their eyes. When he opened it, everyone stands up. Ezra blessed the Lord, the great God. The people answered, "Amen, amen," and they collapse in front of him, right? They bow down before him. They read aloud from the book of the Torah. I'm now at the very end of the last 2 lines of your text. They read aloud from the book of the Torah of God, explaining, applying insight, and making the reading, the lection, comprehensible. Now, what's incredible here, I want you to remember, Ezra and Nehemiah is essentially a single work. We hear about the sense of loss, the impossibility of overcoming the destruction. They're crying bitterly at the rededication of the temple, and yet Ezra stands quite explicitly, right? The rabbis talk about this quite explicitly as another Moses on a wooden tower, giving the law again, giving the Torah again, and repeatedly refers to the law of Moses. Some of the laws he refers to are understood very early on by rabbis as being interpretation. Others we have textual sources for. Through the re-giving of the law, which is what happens here in this text, there's a new possibility of covenant. There's a creation of a new legacy, which is associated with Moses, but linked to Ezra. Right? It's associated with Moses. It reinvokes Sinai, but it's actually the experience of Moses. And And part of what I want us to understand this evening is that, on the one hand, the sense of loss, that one could never summon Moses again, is linked to the fact that Ezra can imagine a new Moses and a new law after destruction and after exile. There's a long story to tell of the history of the ways in which Second Temple Judaism and beyond, the Rabbinic period and well beyond into the medieval period, create the possibility of divine encounter again, while they preserve and institutionalize the destruction of the temple as a permanent part of Jewishness. Destruction and devastation, as I've already said, are never overcome. But there's a new kind of hope, albeit a muted hope, that emerges along the path of a new kind of diaspora community. Jonathan Lear calls his book Radical Hope. And here I call it, in a slightly different way, a muted hope. There is hope, but that hope is always juxtaposed in the prayers and in the reading with a sense of loss. So I want to talk tonight, and I'm going to move to the latter part of my talk now. I want to talk about 4 elements or 4 aspects of overcoming destruction that are found again and again in many of the texts from ancient Judaism. I've already alluded to some of them, and we're going to see some of them now in texts from a text called 4th Ezra, about which I'll speak in a few minutes. So number 1, there is the sense that the space of exile is itself transformed into a new place of revelation. So the place of desert becomes the place of revelation. Or the place of destruction, the locus for destruction for Ezra and Nehemiah is Jerusalem, and it's recovered. Even among the ruins, it's recovered. That's number 1. So space in no place. You know, it's very interesting. Later, much later, Kabbalistic writers speak of Jerusalem as a place that is no place. Atra de lo atra, a place that is no place in the face of exile. In this sense of reimagining, returning to a place of revelation or Sinai after Sinai or after loss. Okay, so that's 1. 2 is invoking the figure of a past. Now, I already gave you an example of this. Ezra stands as Moses, but we no longer have, in the Second Temple period, a normative office of prophet, and this is one of the reasons why the rabbis were led to say that prophecy was over, prophecy was ended. We don't have new Zechariahs and new Jeremiahs, but we have many, many texts that claim to be written by Moses, or claim to be written by Jeremiah, or claim to be written by Ezra. Odd, right? So is this just a simple case of forgery or plagiarism? Or is there something much deeper going on? To what extent are we to understand the claim that Moses wrote this text that I'm reading to you tonight, or this is Moses speaking, as a kind of what we might call modern day channeling, where we extend or expand or interpret the work of earlier writers, be it Moses, be it Ezra, be it Jeremiah, and continue the tradition? This is not unique to Judaism. We find this in the ancient Greek pagan world. We find it in early Christianity. And we find it in Islam. That is, traditions that are linked to earlier figures, and the tradition continues on. The tradition continues on through a kind of strong, powerful interpretive community that continues to interpret and reinterpret the past in the present in order to make the possibility of future again. And that's what's going on in text 6 in your handout. It's not Sinai. You know, where is the light of Sinai, right? And yet, it's Ezra who stands, not with tablets written by the hand of God, right? But it's Ezra that stands with the text. And then elsewhere, those of you that know Ezra and Nehemiah well, the people collapse. They realize what they've lost. They realize what they've forgotten. And there's a sense of loss, but also of failure. That is, the relationship between God and the people. And Ezra and Nehemiah, in different ways, but it's really the voice of Ezra, reassures them and helps them to apply the text in a new context, which is radical, right? It's a radical thing to apply, to stand in the place of Moses after one couldn't be a Moses again, to stand in the place of Jerusalem, of the temple, after one couldn't imagine replacing that temple, and they couldn't overcome the destruction itself. That's the second thing. So space, figure, right, saying that it's Moses, saying that it's Jeremiah, or saying that it's Ezra. The third, which I've spoken to quite a bit, is the idea of reinterpretation of holy texts, the application and the integration of texts of the past into the present. It becomes a reconstitution through, one could say, the interpretation itself. There's so many examples to bring to you today, and some of you who are familiar with early Jewish texts might say, oh, she's just speaking about midrash, right, early rabbinic interpretation. Yes and no, because there's so many different ways in which this was done. There was the rewriting of earlier texts, rewriting of Genesis and inserting lots of other material, which transformed, for example, the character of Abraham, and explained, for example, his famous lie about Sarah, explaining, struggling with the past and the present, trying to make sense of prophetic promises. How do you reinterpret Daniel's promise for an end time, or Daniel interpreting Jeremiah's promise for an end time? These are the struggles of the writers as they try to make the past present and create a context for future. The final aspect, so space, invoking figures of the past or channeling figures of the past, interpretation of Holy Scripture or of divine word in a new context, and the fourth is the actual work of healing, which I've alluded to earlier, the idea of healing or therapy or overcoming of destruction. So I want to give you an example of a text called 4th Ezra. It's canonical for the Catholic Church. It's part of the Apocrypha. It's a text that was written by Jews after the destruction of the Second Temple, But it's said to have been written by that same guy, Ezra. So historically, Ezra could not have written this text. It refers to temples, destruction of temples, and it's written very much aware and in line with other historical developments of the first century of the Common Era. So after 70, most people date it around the same time as the revelation to John, and it's very much committed to not rebuilding the temple, but reconstituting Jewish community through text and interpretation. The very beginning of 4th Ezra, this is text 7 on your handout. This is Ezra, who says he was in Babylon. He speaks of the 30th year of the destruction of his country, i.e., Jerusalem, Israel. And he sees the devastation, the destruction of Zion, and the wealth of those who lived their lives out in Babylon. Now, what's happening in a text like this, and there's so many examples. In this particular text, Ezra becomes not just the Ezra of the past, but he also becomes the Ezekiel of the past, right? It's Ezekiel who was in exile, and he writes on the Kavar Canal after 30 years since the destruction. He also suffers with the people as a kind of Job figure throughout the first few visions, and ultimately, as I said already, becomes an Ezra figure. So there's 7 visions, and he's transformed, refusing to be comforted in the first 3 visions. He refuses to be comforted. He ultimately sings a song of lament, and finally is able to receive prophecy. The entire fulfillment of Ezra's vision happens in the 7th vision. And here, in text 8 on your handout, Ezra says, Ezra writes, he, God, revealed himself to me. And then he says, I revealed myself in a bush and spoke to Moses when my people were in bondage. This is text 8 on your handout. I sent him and led my people out of Egypt, and I led him up to Mount Sinai. I kept him with me for many days. I told him many wondrous things, showed him the secrets of the times, and declared to him the end of times. Then I commanded him, saying, these words you shall publish openly, and these you shall keep secret. And now I say to you, these are the niglot and the nistarot, the hidden and the revealed that 4th Ezra is referring to. Lay up in your heart the signs that I have shown you, the dreams that you have seen, and the interpretation that you have heard. For you shall be taken up from among men. You shall be with my servant and those who are like you. Here, In this text, Ezra receives esoteric books, secret traditions, as well as the texts of it's referred to 24 books of canonical text. Throughout the text, there's this sense of loss that Mosaic covenant is broken after the destruction of the second temple, although he says it's the first temple. And what happens here, quite explicitly, is a repetition of Sinai itself and a repetition of text 6 on your handout. Right? That is two things. It both repeats the experience of Nehemiah, in Ezra Nehemiah on text 6 of your handout. It repeats the experience of Moses, and it says Sinai is possible again. Law is possible again. Divine encounter is possible again at the very time of impossibility. Ezra becomes Moses again. Sinai happens again. Prayer is reinstituted, and covenant is reimagined. This seems like an awfully odd text, but now I want to run to the very last text of our handout before I move towards pulling some of these themes together. Text 10 is one of earliest rabbinic collections from the Jewish rabbinic tradition, a Tosefta Sanhedrin, where Rabbi Yossi says, and here's the last text on your handout, Ezra was sufficiently worthy that the Torah could have been given through him if Moses had not preceded him. This is a remarkable claim because the rabbis also celebrate Ezra for having made special new ordinances, if you will, about the community, about the priestly line, about prohibitions against foreign marriage, and many other takanot, 10 takanot that are attributed to the figure of Ezra in the 6th century. And here the rabbis celebrate Ezra's, let's call it courage, heroism, but also in the Jewish tradition what we might call chutzpah, right? Ezra stands as Moses in Nehemiah 8. Who dared to stand like Moses again? We're told in Deuteronomy there cannot be another Moses. And yet he stands as Moses again. He institutes new legal innovation. And he ultimately redefines Judaism for a new context that is struggling exactly in between the two modes of bechi, of mourning, and simcha, of joy. So by pulling together texts from the Hebrew Bible from the 6th century, by taking a brief look at some of the later traditions about Ezra, and also this extraordinary text of 4th Ezra, which celebrates law and tradition and interpretation as a way of overcoming the destruction of the temple, we begin to see how the overcoming of destruction and how the redefinition of Judaism in the context of Second Temple times becomes formative for later subsequent generations about Judaism and its own survival and its own experience of divine encounter. I want to think again for a moment with you about that last line in text 9 on your handout. And I'll read that last sentence again. The entire culture is in the process of being forgotten. The only hope is to write it down in the hope that future generations may bring it back to life. The language of memory or of forgetting of the past needs to be seen against the possibility of innovation of the present. Because the figures of Ezra, the figures of the rabbinical figures that constitute law, and later leading figures in the face of destruction and violence and loss seek to, I used the word earlier, channel earlier figures and apply a new context for thinking about a vibrant Jewish tradition. What I want to offer to you this evening is that Judaism certainly overcame destruction and devastation through the determination to survive, but not by forgetting the past, but rather by integrating what was both beautiful and ugly, what was both song and lament, what was both victory and devastation, what ultimately will be called the darkness and the light, that as the communities picked up pieces of their present in their own, and quite literally, that is to reassemble a physical presence for themselves, be it in Jerusalem, be it in Rome, be it in other communities, diaspora communities, and ultimately re-inherited and reinterpreted their past, which didn't map onto their present. That is, the struggle or the crisis was that these prophetic texts of the past did not resonate, did not speak to the communities of the present after a devastation. How could they have prepared the way for that kind of present? And the answer is the leadership transformed the past in the present, not by changing the history, not by rewriting history, but by re-understanding, by imagining and, if you will, meditating or focusing on the texts of the past and trying to help them resonate with their own community as they imagined a strong and new possible future, which was dynamic and lasting. So I've got a lot of texts here, and I'm happy to talk to you about them, but also to address other questions you have of a comparative nature or specifically to ancient Judaism. So thank you. So I'm happy to entertain questions. I think Sister Susan has a microphone. Okay.
Yes, we have to use the microphone because we need to record what you ask and what can be.
Sure.
Okay, so please feel free to come forward.
I couldn't help thinking, during your excellent talk, to think of the great chorus from Giuseppe Verdi's Nabucco, Nebuchadnezzar. Go, my thoughts on golden wings, basso in cielo sulle ali dorate. I thought it would be a wonderful conclusion to your excellent.
Thank you.
But I do have a little question too. Was there not a temple between the destruction of the Solomons and Herod by Zerubbabel? I don't know what happened to it really. It was not was destroyed presumably, but what is the story connected with that?
The history, the archaeological history of the various of the temple construction. So, well, there was a temple that was built. It's attributed to Ezra and Nehemiah's work. The figure of Zerubbabel is present and then suddenly absent in the text. Zerubbabel is a kind of mystery. He is, of course, of the line of David, and that would be very important because he's part of the messianic line, which seems to then be lost or compromised. From a political standpoint, scholars understand that he might have been quite a threat because of the reconstitution of Davidic authority. It's one thing to reconstitute a temple and religious authority. It's something very different to reconstitute political independence. It's certainly the case that we have very little textual evidence about the temple. We have the chronicler, the Divrei Hayamim. We have Ezra and Nehemiah. We have texts that describe the rituals in that temple. Qumran criticizes that temple profoundly. Beyond that, I think what we should say is that there are many different communities throughout the late Second Temple period that are building and then again rebuilding with a kind of fervor that's promised in Second and then Third Isaiah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I have one more little question.
Yes, please.
In the diaspora, was there ever any talk of
In the what? I'm sorry. In the in the diaspora. Yes, I'm sorry. Yes.
I was thinking in the diaspora,
Yes. No, please.
Was there ever any thought of building a third temple, something that would be a focus for the Jewish world?
Well, there certainly were possibilities that this might happen in later centuries subsequent to the Second Temple. It seems that from the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 that was over, that the rabbis no longer wanted to risk the community itself. There was talk about a possible third temple, and surprisingly, this was not embraced by the rabbis. People have argued for political reasons, people have argued for reasons of danger in the sense of wanting to keep the messianic spirit or fervor quieted after the community was ultimately decimated. I heard Chana Cotton, who's an archaeologist and a classicist in Hebrew University, speak a little bit about about the period of 132. People think about 70 as a period of real destruction, but it's actually 132 where there was complete and utter decimation of the community. And I think that's the beginning, although it's a great question, but that's the beginning of trying to understand how the prayers would continue to call for a reconstitution and a rebuilding of temple. And there was a period of time when it was pretty clear that this was offered to the Jewish community, and ultimately it wasn't embraced by the leadership.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure, thank you.
That was a wonderful exposition of paradox, and I wanted to address your first citation on the Havot Babel, and the psalmist there says, and you have pointed this out too, that I can't sing. How can I sing? How can we sing under these circumstances of loss and desolation? But it comes out as a song, which is perhaps another layer of paradox. I'm sure you thought of that.
I have a brief answer and then I have a long answer. Let me give you the brief answer. The brief answer is a shirah, song in Hebrew, is happy, it's joyous. There aren't sad songs. There's kina, from konein, to lament. Part of what I want to say about By the Waters of Babylon is what's offered is actually not a Shir Tzion, a Song of Zion. And you notice at the beginning of text 1 on your handout, there are a number of references, and this was not lost on the rabbinic interpreters of this psalm, that seem to suggest that this is a group of Levites in Babylon, and they literally hang up their harps. They suspend their harps because they can't play them. But what can happen is they can lament, they can mourn. You see this again after the destruction of the second temple, the sense of suspension of divine encounter or prayer, but lament is possible. The earliest keynote laments over lamentation you find in that same book of 4th Ezra. There's actually a lamentation. So part of my response to you is that the song itself is not song in joy, but it's lament, and it becomes almost a paradigm of lament, which will have very significant repercussions for later traditions. New laments are written, and this is a slightly longer, let me just take one more second. They're new laments that are written and rewritten and rewritten. That is, they're laments over new destructions, and then whether it was the horrible murders at York in England, or after the Holocaust, there were new laments that were written very much in the style of or inspired by a book like Lamentations that continue to be integrated into, so innovation is possible even in the space of destruction where you can't lament, you can utter nothing, and yet you continue to mourn.
Maybe that's what Adorno meant when he said that after the Holocaust there could be no poetry.
Well, so I was thinking about that right now, actually, as you said, about Adorno's very, very, very famous line. Primo Levi did write poetry as well as write books. The question, and this is actually an historical question, goes back to your first question about the temple and destruction and rebuilding. The question actually is an historical question about Lamentations. One of the big debates with scholars is whether or not Lamentations could have been written right after the destruction. Because it's actually not a language, a philological argument. It's not an archaeological argument. It's actually an argument about healing. Is it possible, like in the case of Adorno, when he says it's not possible, poetry isn't possible, and yet some of the most extraordinary art has been inspired by the worst forms of devastation and terror. So the question of lament, is it paradoxical? It's new song, new lament. Yeah, thank you.
Most helpful.
Thank you.
Is there still a place somewhere in the heart of Judaism for a conviction and an aspiration for a third temple and a restored Mount Zion, where Jews, scattered Jews and oppressed Jews can be gathered together in a great uprising? Or has this whole tradition become eschatology, and people await a glorious kingdom in the hereafter? And is there such a thing as the Jewish outlook on such a multi-dimensional tradition?
This is, I'm gonna I'm going to come around. Is that okay? I can do this, maybe. You can hear me like this, right? It's such a great question. So my first answer to you is yes, yes, and yes. It's a great question, but this is a question that we're not only asking now. This question was asked during the period of the Second Temple, during the actual period of the Second Temple while it was standing. And I'll give you an example. The text that we find among the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of them refer to actually building another temple, a new temple, a correct temple, because they're extremely critical of what's going on in Jerusalem in the 2nd and 1st century before the Common Era. A second response in Qumran is to say not an actual temple, but what we're building is a heavenly temple, right? A temple like Eden, right? An idealized temple. The struggle of whether or not the rebuilding of a temple is the place where God resides, right? Where divine encounter is to be expressed, comes up again and again in prayers, in texts, and throughout the history of Jewish civilization. I'm not actually I'm not answering your more politicized question about the building of the third temple. Where are you? There you are. Hi. And what I would say is that it's certainly not part of any normative form of Judaism, and it certainly would not enable a healthy dynamic currently in the Middle East. If this moved forward, I think we would see, to invoke a text like John, all hell would break loose. I think the issue of survival and containment and understanding is a very, very important part of Jewish survival. And this goes back to the question of the possibility. Wasn't there a possibility that a third temple would be rebuilt? And the decision was not to go that path. The decision, and this happens in this extraordinary text of 4th Ezra, which is not preserved by Jewish traditions. It ends not with a new temple, but it ends with new text, old text and new text, with the possibility of the interpretation of these texts in the future. How to map that on to the prayers that ask for, sacrifice again and temple again is a challenge. The question is, what do little ones, when they pray for a temple, what do they mean? And I think right now I want to say that it's somewhere in between heaven and earth. I want to say that it's somewhere in that liminal space, but it's full of prayer. And it's an excellent question. It's a hard question, but it's a question we have to take seriously. Yeah, thank you. Yes, hi.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I wanted to make a comment and ask a question. The question first is about Jewish practices, and particularly after that first exile in Babylon.
Yes.
We think of the festival prayer, pilgrimage festivals of Sukkot, Pesach, and Shavuot, going to Jerusalem. So I wonder how that might be practiced in Babylon when you can't actually go. But the other comment I wanted to make, which may bear upon this in some way, is the passage which you've brought us from Nehemiah makes an interesting point of transformation between life in Israel with Jerusalem and the temple, and life for this community in Babylon. And it's that Jewish practice, it seems to me, when the temple was there and Jews were in Israel, would have involved on the part of the priests undertaking sacrifices, and on the part of the people witnessing and bringing the materials for them. The practice here is now a literary one. They're reading the text of Torah, listening to it and weeping. It's like marking the transformation to a literal and a literacy-oriented religious practice.
Yes. Okay, thank you. It's an excellent question, and what I want to do is give you a broader context to answer the question, which is Ezra and Nehemiah talk about sacrifice in the Second Temple, and they talk about it a lot. And Ezra is obsessed with getting, I'm sorry to use a funny verb here, but getting the right genealogy, lining everyone up from beginning to end. They've not in any way compromised their commitment to sacrifice and their commitment to priestly ritual. And in fact, which is also very interesting, when they talk about the orders of the priests and the Levites, they invoke two names. two names they invoke, which neither of them actually map on to the first temple. They did them just like Moses, and they did them just like David. David didn't build the temple, right? He wasn't permitted to. But they authorized, this goes back to my point towards the end of my paper today, my talk tonight, that David becomes, he authorizes this new Second Temple practice. That this is a related part of your question, so let me bracket that for a moment. But first to say that if we were to sit together and read Ezra and Nehemiah, there's a lot of ritual and a lot of sacrifice. There's a further part of your question which I want to go back to now, and then we'll come back to the point about my sidebar about David. Practices. We do know that public reading seemed to be referred to throughout what we would call pre-exilic, that is before the destruction of the first temple texts. We know from someone like Philo of Alexandria, much, much later in the first century of the Common Era, that Jewish communities outside of Israel sat and read texts on Saturday mornings together. He describes synagogue practices in a text that was excerpted from a church father named Eusebius. And he talks about reading the Torah in public. So we know very early on, and then subsequent centuries, that was a very important part of Judaism. And this actually takes me back. Let me. Does that answer, or beginning to answer your question? About the pilgrimage holidays. So what did they do when they couldn't go? And the answer is, we don't really know what they did when they were in Babylon. What we do know is that the dates and the calendrical stuff, we've got lots of inconsistent texts about when the recording of the dates. The question of what actually went on in that period in Babylon, the writing of texts we hear about, the practice, the increasing prominence of laws around the Sabbath, and the Sabbath becoming a kind of locus for temple or temple-like practices, bringing sacred space into the home. This is something that one of my teachers, John Levinson, has written about in quite a brilliant way. Beyond that, we hear talk throughout the Second Temple period about people going back for pilgrimage holidays. Was it impossible to celebrate Passover in the absence of going to Jerusalem? And the answer is, that's pretty clear. The answer is no. That there were opportunities for, not necessarily for sacrifice, although that also seems not to be as centralized as Josiah's reforms will tell you in the book of Kings. So what I'd like to say is that ritual independent of temple clearly continued on from the exile on. And many of the communities never returned. I mean, Ezra and Nehemiah mourn that. But we also know that there was a community in Alexandria well before Philo of Alexandria, and we have texts and we have traditions that suggest an ongoing witness or testimony to Jewish communities that did practice Sabbath and practiced holidays. To close my answer to your question about writing and reading, that clearly was a very important part of Judaism well before the exile. And what I want to say is that writing and public reading as a way of affecting divine response, calling out and reading a text, was a very powerful way of experiencing divine encounter. At a later point, and this is where I do want to agree with you, that this became increasingly the norm in Judaism. And my own advisor, James Kugel, has written about this quite extensively, and so has Michael Fishbane and many others, that is, the writing and the authority and the interpretation of these texts became a very central form of a Jewish encounter of the divine. It's not actually a giving up of or an abandonment of sacrifice. And this actually goes back to, this is a theme in many of your questions, what about a third temple? Or what about this ongoing challenge of Judaism in the absence of sacrifice? And I want to give you two answers to the question. Let me reformulate the question for a moment. To what extent are the daily prayers, morning, afternoon, and evening prayers, a way of keeping the place, a placeholder for the sacrificial system in Judaism? And there are two ways in which the prayer services are said to correspond to temple service. One is just, that for each prayer, for each sacrifice, there were prayers, and these are constituted and were kind of placeholders. But there's another answer in Masechet Brachot, in Tractate Brachot in the Babylonian Talmud. And that is long before there was a temple, these prayers were already established. And they're proof texts that are linked to Abraham, and then to Isaac, and then to Jacob. And these proof texts each correspond to the morning, the afternoon, and evening prayer. You were actually asking about public reading, but public reading and prayer as a way of communicating with the divine is already always part of the Jewish memory. So to what extent is that holding a place for sacrifice, or to what extent is that suggesting that maybe sacrifice was itself a way of responding to a place-holding prayer? People have, I think, wrongly argued that prayer becomes more prominent as sacrifice is absent. But the interlinking, the interconnectedness of prayer and sacrifice very early on in Judaism suggests the idea of reading and performance alongside sacrifice. So you gave me a lot of rich questions. Oh, and why David? Can I ask this question and answer it? So why does David become this really important figure? I've talked a little bit about Moses. I want to talk about David for just a few minutes, if I can be permitted to. David becomes the hero for many of the Second Temple texts, and he's no longer just a king, right? He's remembered as a prophet. He's remembered, of course, as the sweet singer of songs, but it's more than that, and his words become prophets, and many, many, many psalms are written and attributed to the figure of David, much like I was talking about repeating the experience of Sinai. But why David is my question for you this evening. And this goes back to the question of destruction and rebuilding of the temple. He lived, first of all, he suffered a kind of exile from temple before temple for sins. He repents, he's forgiven, and ultimately he's brought back into the tradition and celebrated as a kind of prophetic king and the head of this messianic line, right? He's the father, if you will, of the Davidic kingdom. But he becomes the perfect embodiment of kind of the celebration of kingdom and remembering temple sacrifice. And again, you might say, but he didn't build the temple. And yet he somehow associated, it was his dream, it was his hope that he never lived in. To go back to your question about waiting for a temple, never experiencing a temple, David becomes the hero, but he also becomes the hero that knows what suffering is, and he knows what loss is. He knows what a certain kind of exile is, an exile that's never overcome. So he becomes a kind of hero already for the Second Temple period, perhaps an incomplete or an imperfect Third Temple, like we saw in Ezra and Nehemiah, chapter 3, the mourning and the joy. Ezra and Nehemiah attribute temple practices to the figure of David, and then this sense of loss and repentance and mourning that's linked to David is a very deep way of responding to your question about a kind of prayer that becomes normative over sacrifice. But it's a very fine line, and the hope for sacrifice is never erased from the prayers themselves. And the rabbis never stop talking about how to offer correct sacrifices in the temple. I mean, to this very day, people study the how-to manuals of how to do correct sacrifice without any practical implications, how to do correct sacrifice if the temple were to be rebuilt, as that itself, the study of those texts, is itself considered to be redemptive, like prayer or like good deeds within a community. Yes? Is there a question? No, please. You're asking another answer to why David. So David was very humble. Moses was the humblest of all men. Jeremiah refused a call because he's but a lad. Isaiah says, my lips are unholy. What renders these people ready for appointment, and yet David is extraordinarily arrogant and thought that he had the right to assume all sorts of things and kill off a husband so he could take a wife that was beautiful. So you get the contrast of you get the contrast. David's humility David's righteousness, David's perfection, and yet David's repentance and his own sense of mortality and loss. And that's all embodied in the figure of David, but also in the figure of Moses. Right? Remember in Deuteronomy when God says, get up on that mountain. You see over there, you see that land, the one that you've been working towards your whole life to get to? You will never go there. You will never realize this. And why? It's because of your arrogance. It's because you mislaid your own strength. And you misrepresented your own strength. It was divine power. And there's a much more complicated narrative to tell about Moses as well. But all of these figures that are selected are the call to prophecy, if you will. And I think this is also true for David. It's is a call that requires that kind of humility. But you had another concern about David and his humility, yes? Is there something else? Yes. Right, so the language of pleasing to God is actually a first link to the figure of Abraham, like a friend of God. And this gets repeated again with later figures. But there were moments of displeasure as well. You know, the complexity of that struggle, of an inner human struggle that's mapped onto David, I think also was part of why after the exile, he also became a hero. He embodied both sin and the fulfillment of commandment, kind of all at once. And he was able to kind of accept or internalize destruction as mapped onto his own self, and then overcome that. There are many, many psalms that are attributed to David throughout later Second Temple times. Is this just is it the kind of thing that we would, call plagiarism as professors in universities today? Or is there something else very profound going on? And the figure himself becomes a symbol of, again, mourning, destruction, and loss, and also celebration. Yes? Go ahead.
I just had this short question. I was so puzzled that I didn't know it at all. And I have this question. I think if you say that the key of the survival of the culture is to reconnect with constantly the older layers or older things, who makes the baby suffer? Because that should be some kind of a beginning for a culture that produces that out of nothing, like some kind of a creation in your own sense. And also the other part of my question is that don't you think that in a way there is this interesting mutuality that also the present recreates the past and also recreates some kind of a past or some kind of a present that incorporates the past, which is like some kind of a special time that that is more than what's present and past, so that incorporates the time.
So I understand your two excellent, very, very insightful questions to actually be a single question. So I'd like to reformulate it and tell me if I can answer it. So it's really about, is it really the case that they're just inheriting the past, or is there a radical transformation of the past and the present? Part of what happens, Borges writes about this, as does T.S. Eliot, and it's very helpful. It's about constituting a precursor. So the David about whom you spoke, or the Ezra that Fourth Ezra writes about, is a radically different Ezra. The Ezra in Fourth Ezra is compassionate to this woman who's lost her child, tries to help comfort her. He overcomes destruction not by building a temple, but by re-giving the law and being celebrated as a prophet who can explain Daniel's prophecies. That's a very different Ezra. And that Ezra then gets mapped onto, not only by Fourth Ezra, but later rabbinic texts, as who Ezra is. So the character of Ezra changes, and they create later forms of Judaism, of Christianity, transform earlier biblical figures, create new precursors. They change the figures of the past. What I'm not suggesting tonight is that it's a radical violence to actual history. That's not what they're doing. What's happening is the struggle to create an interpretive community that's compelling for the present. And there isn't only one narrative in Judaism in the Second Temple period. There are many, many communities, and you in your initial question alluded to some of that, and I just don't have time this evening to talk about the various different communities. There also seems to be a temple in Egypt that didn't actually sacrifice animals, but their prayers and their texts that are found. So the struggle to try to recreate the past and the present actually rewrites the past. It rewrites the past. I'll give you another example of the figure of Moses. I alluded to this just very briefly earlier on in my lecture this evening. Philo of Alexandria is writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, okay, before the destruction of the Second Temple. And he reimagines the figure of Moses, and he talks about Moses as the greatest statesman. In fact, he knew when he had teachers come to him in Egypt, Philo of Alexandria writes, he already intuited all of the laws of musical harmony in mathematics, Pythagorean mathematics. He already knew it. Not only that, not only was he a great interpreter, but he himself was a great politician, and he was the best nomos thetes, the best lawgiver in the world, better than Solon and Lycurgus. What is he doing to Moses? He's turning him into one like Socrates, or better than Socrates, better than Solon. So to kind of exaggerate your question a bit, and it's a great question, and I think it's a single question. It's about the, right? Yes, am I answering your question? Good. So the power of the present is to inherit the past, to keep it going. And instead of you talked about, don't we need a point of origin? Well, my talk this evening, and this is why it's such a beautiful and very generous question, is to try to think about overcoming destruction in ancient Judaism as a kind of forward moving. If you heard the last line that I offered you this evening, it was about a dynamic, forward moving, innovative structure. And your question about practices actually picked up just on that. You just went farther than I was prepared to go to for Ezra and Nehemiah. But you're absolutely right in the way you were asking the question, that what I was speaking to in my talk this evening was a forward moving development, courageous, innovative spirit, or let's call it divine encounter with Judaism in the present that of course transforms the past, because the past doesn't map onto it. If I go back to the analogy that I brought you, the comparative analogy from the Crow Indians, in this beautiful book, it's actually not a very long book, I recommend it to all of you. His representation of the Sioux Indians have been very criticized, but the discussion of the Crow is very, very sophisticated. Part of what he shows is that the past is completely transformed by the creation of new prophecy or new song. And that's exactly what you're asking. You're saying, is it really the past? I think you're saying, is it really the past that's being invoked? And my answer is no. The past is recreated. There are new precursors. There's a Moses that's imagined in the context of a Jewish community living in Alexandria, and the authorities, right, it's the Greco-Roman world. The heroes are Socrates and Solon. And and Philo says, Moses is better than all of that. Moses was just like you, great, better, and already knew natural law. He says, Moses is a perfect, he was perfect. He already knew the law before the law. But even more than that, he was able to write a perfect copy of an unwritten law, the unwritten law of the heavens. Only Moses could actually translate that. And where is that law? That law is the Torah. So if you actually want an example of perfect law, which you can't get on your own, the Jews have a guide. And he says, and you know what? That guide was translated into Greek, says Philo. This is an amazing story. And he tells the story of the writing of the Septuagint, the translation of the Hebrew into the Greek. And then he says, and it was absolutely a miracle when the text, a complete miracle, all these people translating exactly the same. It's divine revelation. They were put on an island, waters above them, waters below them, and there was a new Torah, which sounds just like a rewriting of Genesis. Slightly different than two other versions of the story of the making of the Septuagint. And then there's one more piece, and he says, and we all know that's why all of the nations every year come and celebrate, and I'm sure you all know this holiday very well, Septuagint Day. Actually, no one seems to know about this holiday. But he says that is the greatest holiday. We all come and celebrate the perfect Greek law. This goes right back to your question, because the actual experience of writing or rewriting the Torah becomes it rereads the book of Genesis against Plato's Timaeus. And everything's changed. Everything's changed. Nothing looks the same again. The story's a completely different story. I'm sorry, it's a very long answer to an excellent question. But what your question did is actually provide a larger context to think about what I tried to do in a very small way with the emergence of a figure of Ezra who transforms, who, by the way, that figure of Ezra is transformed yet again and again in later rabbinic hands, as a celebration of the figure of the past, but also as an authorization of the present. Yeah, thank you for your question. Thanks. Yeah, sure. Thank you.
And as we bring our evening to a close, I'd just like to invite a very good friend of the Office of Campus Ministry and King's University College, Rabbi Charney from Or Shalom Synagogue, to offer thanks to Professor Najman on behalf of all of us.
Sometimes things happen almost by divine providence. Last night I was talking to a group that was asking me to what I would attribute the resilience of the Jewish people and the fact that the Phoenicians and the Assyrians and the Persians and they're not around, and yet the Jews are. And I think it has to do a little bit with what we've heard tonight. The ability to adapt, to recreate, and in a way to internalize the past and through us make it also the future, which is a little bit of what we've heard here tonight. In the name of all of those who've been mentioned as sponsors of the lectures, etc., I'd like to thank you and present this to you for coming to us tonight, to wish you a very safe journey home tonight. She didn't accept the invitation to stay in London, but we hope you have a safe trip home, as well as everybody else here tonight. We also hope you will join us for our future lectures. Please pick up a pamphlet on the way out so that you know when to be here and when to join us for the next lecture. Thank you, everyone. Good night, and recreate the past for the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.